Alright guys, this episode is going to be a whirlwind. If you haven't connected the dots yet, the Ferrari is going to SEMA with CSF radiators, and I've got about 10 days left to finish it up. This episode format's going to be a little bit different than normal because I have not been recording over these last 2 weeks, not like I normally do. It's going to be more of a highlight reel because I have been working like crazy to get the car finished. I feel really good about it. The next episode you guys see, this car will move under its own power if there are no major issues. So let's keep our fingers crossed. Let me show you what we've gotten done. And a special thanks to Omaze for sponsoring this episode. 2 weeks ago, we got the engine bay of the Ferrari fully sandblasted and then coated in a fresh coat of black paint. I have spent months criticizing just how ugly Ferrari's factory chassis work is, and to be frank, I'm not sure we'll ever do anything to make it look much better. But the black paint hides Ferrari's crimes, and I think this whole thing is going to transform drastically once we drop our engine back into place. I sent out all of the engine mounts, parts, and pieces to get powder coated, and they have returned and are ready for installation. This is the first time in a year and a half that I've seen these parts in something other than a rusty finish, so I'm really excited for how this is coming together. With the engine in place, it's impossible to fit the fuel cell in, so it is first on the list and first to be crossed off. Following that, the engine is dropped into place, and then I recently got our turbo manifold back from the ceramic coater. I had Brett Walker machine the flange itself perfectly flat, and then had it finished in titanium silver. I was hoping for white, but I couldn't find anything ready to handle the temperatures this thing will see, so silver it is. I'm still eager to rebuild this manifold later down the line because I know I could do a much better job this day and age, but I'm still happy to see how it'll perform, and I think it turned out reasonably well for my first ever real TIG project. From here, it's a highlight reel of parts installation. You've seen every one of these parts and pieces go into the car before. Although there are some mild changes, such as the fact that our throttle body is finally fully welded. The devil is in these small details that get the car to the finish line. We're still missing our plumbing and our wiring, but all of the hard parts are back in the engine bay, and this thing looks absolutely incredible. Frankly, it's a dream come true. I never expected the outcome to be this good, but with the manifold and the exhaust fully coated, all of the charge piping in the intercooler brushed, and everything else either painted or powder coated, this thing looks like $1,000,000, and I am stoked. This build may have taken a long time to get to this point, but I think it goes to show what a little bit of extra effort on that fit and finish can do for a project. We've still got other details like installing our mag valve cover, but that'll happen in the next episode. For now, let's turn the clock back one more time and talk about those lower quarter panels that I removed from the car. These are one of the few fiberglass components to the 308, and while the outside looks good, the part that was visible inside of the engine bay is absolutely hideous. It's rough, unfinished fiberglass, because it was never really meant to be seen. It comes with carpet over top of it from the factory. But in our case, I couldn't stand looking at it and all of the ugly structure attached to it, so I want to cut it apart. The plan is to leave behind only the exterior shell, and in turn giving us a lot of open space in the engine bay. But I'm going to take my time on cutting these apart because if I mess up, I'm in deep trouble. There's a pair of these for sale on eBay right now for $5,000 each. That's probably because they're no longer available from Ferrari, and the only way to get some is from a wrecked car, of which there aren't many. But if I let the fear of cutting up things I can't afford to replace dissuade me, well, this project would never have gotten off the ground. So, fearlessly, we're going to chop these things to bits. We're left with an outer skin, but no structure with which to mount it, so on the lathe, I turned down some 1-inch long, 35 thousandths thick segments of tube, and we're going to attach some weld nuts to the ends of them. At less than 1 millimeter thick, this is definitely my tiniest weld job so far, but I'm excited to try it out. Now because this stuff is so thin, I'm just going to fuse weld it. There's no reason to add filler material because we're going to get solid penetration from the arc alone. As you can see, these are extremely tiny welds, and I had a bit of undercutting, but I'm excited about it. The lower quarter panel had 2 pre-existing holes, so we're going to mount those tube nuts to these holes and then figure out how to attach that to the chassis. I bolted a third and final tube nut to the original bumper shock mount, which now supports our wing. I then bridged that gap with 1/2-inch diameter 35 thousandths wall tube. Because of flexibility in the quarter panel and the fiberglass, it took a lot of effort to make sure both lower quarter panels were mounted at the exact same angle. It took a lot more work and time than expected, but the lower quarter panels are now mounted and they're extremely rigid. a much better solution than what we had from the factory. We can cross these strong, lightweight mounts off the list and move on to our headlights. As some of you guys might remember, I bought these Hella Jumbo 220 driving lights as an alternative to the pop-ups and as an alternative to a more typical quad driving light as found on the 288 GTO. I like this solution a lot because I know that it's unique and it still retains a bit of a factory look in the front end of the 308. It's not garishly aftermarket. The problem is we've got to figure out exactly how we want to mount them. My buddy Ryan spent the day at the shop and together we brainstormed a lot of different ideas on how to pull this off before landing on something that we thought made true sense. I wanted something not only lightweight and adjustable, but also simple at its core. After welding some bits and pieces of aluminum together, we landed on this. Now, even I can admit this is a completely ridiculous looking headlight mount sitting by itself on the workbench, but hear me out, I think it makes some sense. The Hella slides over the 5/8 aluminum rod through its original pivoting mount, and this gives us the ability to pitch the light up and down. Slotted holes on the chassis side of the mount give us the ability to pitch the light inwards and outwards, whether that's towards the side of the road or towards the center. And then last, I put some clevis mounts on the bottoms of the lights so that we can lock everything into place by using these small turnbuckles that I fabricated off screen. And by using these fixed rod ends, we can actually lock the position of the light into place with no extra hardware. In all, the lights have a great range of motion for adjustment, and I'm really happy with the solution given the fact that it weighs hardly anything at all. Seeing the finished lights in place without the covers is even more exciting, and the front end of this thing is really coming together. All that's left is we need a front grille and to mount that splitter. Remember when I said I didn't film everything over the last 2 weeks? That's because some of it is flat out boring, especially when it involves taping off the entirety of the inside of the 308. And if you think I'm underestimating, no. I mean the entirety of the inside of the 308. This is more than 3 full rolls of tape and more than a day's work of masking off everything that I could. And you might be wondering why, but the answer should be pretty obvious. It's because the inside of this car is ugly. Ferrari's fiberglass and sheet metal work in here are ugly. And to be clear, paint won't help, but black paint might at least hide it. So with everything masked off, I painted the inside of the car. And while the paint dried, I turned my attention towards the dashboard, which originally was in good shape, but it's now completely covered in sand and has a bit of damage that I'd like to repair. The sand is an easy fix, it's just a result of sandblasting the car without removing the dashboard. Some leather cleaner and conditioner took care of everything, but on the other hand, some of the glue that holds the leather down to the dash itself has deteriorated over the years. With everything fixed in the dash and back in the car, you get an idea of how the interior is shaping up, especially with some fresh black paint. We've still got a lot of interior paneling to install and some carpet to glue down, but I think this is shaping up. As you guys know, I'm not huge on ad integrations, but when Omaze reached out to me and said not only could my audience enter for a chance to win a sick car, we could also support charity at the same time, I said that is what I'm all about, so this episode is brought to you guys by Omaze. The Buick GNX is considered to be the last muscle car ever made, and with a 3.8-liter V6 under the hood producing 276 horsepower and 360 foot-pounds of torque, it is a well-earned reputation. This one's number 51 of just 547 produced, and it only has 2,000 miles on the odometer. That means it's worth an estimated $185,000, and the car includes taxes and shipping. You can enter for your chance to win this car at omaze.com/StanceWorks, where your donations will go towards supporting and benefiting the American Civil Liberties Union Foundation. Since 1920, the ACLU has sought to preserve and defend the individual liberties of everyone in this country, no matter who they are or where they're from. So if you ask me, entering this sweepstakes is a win-win. So again, head to omaze.com/StanceWorks for your chance to win this insane car and to do some good at the same time. All right, it is about midnight. Just finished up my aluminum bulkhead covers. Again, I wish I had recorded this whole thing, but I just needed to focus on building them. But they turned out sick. All of my bends lined up really well. They fit the inside of the car perfectly. My snaps worked out perfectly. These guys are quick disconnects. I can just press the button, the panels come off, and then I can push them, they snap back into place. I'm stoked with how these turned out. It was a way bigger project than I anticipated. Probably took realistically all day to get everything fit the way I wanted it to get all the bends to line up. I bent both panels at the same time, to get all my snaps perfectly in a row, figure out where I can position them, get those to line up with the panels, etc., etc. They're pretty much done, but now I need to wrap them in carpet, and I want to do that before I go to bed. So let's see what they look like all finished, and boom. Now, there's still panels that go above these that kind of trim everything out, but overall, I am stoked on how these bulkhead covers turned out. They're really simple and fit that F40-esque minimalism that I'm looking for, and they do a great job of hiding Ferrari's ugly chassis that's hidden behind them. And then, of course, there are those push-button quick releases which give me access to the storage space behind them. If you haven't seen previous episodes, this is where all of the car's electronics live, the PDM, the ECU, and a handful of other modules. Speaking of, I need to get those installed ASAP. But for now, let's turn our attention to the hood. I mentioned in a previous episode that I was giving this hood to my friend Paul, better known as Son of Cobra. He's incredibly talented when it comes to custom composites, and he's going to take the work that I've put into this hood and transform it entirely. He'll bodywork it to perfection, and then use it as a plug for a mold, so that we can have a custom carbon fiber hood. Last week, he invited me to his workshop just down the street so that I could see his progress so far. He had finished all of the bodywork and had test fitted the hood on the car to make sure it was going to fit exactly the way that we want it to. To say he had done an incredible job up to this point is an understatement. He fixed every problem I had introduced with my own work, and then gave the hood his own flair. He introduced a lip to the leading edge of the duct for better airflow, and refined all of the edges so that it was aesthetically perfect. But we're not using this hood. Instead, he's used this hood to make a perfect mold. The beauty here is that if I ever need a replacement hood, or if somebody else wants one that's just like mine, we can now make as many as we want. Paul called me over when he was ready to infuse the very first part, and this was a true moment of excitement. Watching the resin rush through the flow media and into the carbon fiber itself, this was watching a part come to life before my very eyes. If you're unfamiliar with the process, a vacuum pump draws resin through dry carbon fiber throughout the entirety of the part. It will then cure inside of this mold, be placed into an oven, and then about 24 hours later, we'll get to see the finished result. But what was an agonizing, exciting wait for me is mere moments for you. The following afternoon, Paul called me over so that I could film the process of breaking the carbon hood free from the mold. I've never tackled a part quite like this, but I can attest firsthand that this is the worst part of the whole process. It's hard work and it fights the entire time. Eventually, though, Paul worked his way around the entire mold, breaking away all of the leftover resin, the peel ply, and the flow media. This began to reveal the carbon part underneath, as well as the geometric reinforcements layered inside of the carbon itself. This will be a single-piece hood when it's done, with one seam in the middle because of a two-part mold. When the part is freed, it will still need quite a bit of finishing work, but you'll see what a craftsman Paul is, because the part itself is still absolutely impressive. It still needs trimming, polishing, and some touch-ups here and there, as well as work to cover the seam in the middle of the duct. But even still, I cannot believe how amazing this hood looks already. Paul's craftsmanship has all of the carbon weave perfectly straight and all of the contours lining up with one another. To be frank, it feels like it would be a crime to paint this hood, so we'll have to see what I decide later down the line. All right, now we gotta shift gears, we gotta talk front suspension. We've got all of our geometry figured out except for one thing, which I've mentioned in the past. We do not have our Ackermann angle figured out. Now, forgive the talking head segment. I have explained Ackermann briefly before. I'm gonna do it again for those that missed it. Skip ahead if you want. But Ackermann angle is important. Imagine your car is driving around a fixed point, a cone in a parking lot. You're driving in a circle. The size of that circle is different for your inside front wheel versus your outside front wheel. That inside wheel is turning on a smaller circle than the outside one, thanks to the width of your car, the track width. You need to get the differential between those, that delta between the inside wheel and the outside wheel, dialed in correctly so that your tires aren't scrubbing as you're going through a turn. Now, that's typically defined by the length of your steering arm in relation to the overall wheelbase and a few other factors. I did some math, I made some changes to our steering arms. I believe that I am within a degree and we can fine tune it later. So that is solved at this point. But there's one other thing we need to do. Some of you guys might remember, we have a really tall bump steer spacer, which means we've got a really long lever pulling on our steering arm. I want to get that into double shear so we don't have to worry about it anymore. Here's how I did it. I'm using some simple 2-inch wide cold rolled stock for this job. My plan is to make a really simple reinforcement so that our tie rod is mounted in double shear. Some of you guys may think that my overall plan is a bit weak, but it really only needs to be strong on one axis, so we're going to keep it simple and lightweight. After figuring out some complicated math on exactly what shape this arm needs to be to line up with the lower mount and to get the Ackermann angle correct, I buzzed it out on the bandsaw and then finished it on my disc sander that finally works. I clamped it into place, TIG welded it to our spindle, and then called it done. All that's left is to coat this thing in some Steelit. Somewhere along the line, I pressed in the ball joints, and we can cross these off the list as well. They're ready for our wheel hubs, which we'll get to here in a moment. We'll also need our control arms, which means we need to rebuild our lower ball joints. These are full of dust and grime from being in the workshop for over a year now, so I pulled them apart, cleaned them up, and we're going to reassemble them, torque them to spec, and grease them appropriately. From here, they get reinstalled in the lower control arms, and if you remember from the last episode, we sent them out for powder coat. I landed on a champagne-ish, brassy silver color as something unique and not too off the shelf, and the outcome is amazing. I couldn't be happier with the choice of color, and the powder coat itself looks great on these things. I'm really happy with how they turned out. They look like professionally built parts, and that means if I can do it, any of you guys can too. And with that, all of our suspension is ready to go back on the car, except for one simple problem. We're missing something. So the problem at hand is my wheel studs are not long enough. I don't have very much thread engagement on my lug nuts. I want to put extended wheel studs into my hubs. They are not here yet. I don't want to assemble all of the suspension only to take it all back apart in another day when they show up. They might even be here today. So suspension's going to wait. Then it can all go on. Brakes can go back on. All that jazz. Everything should work though. It's all been on the car before. The only question will be we've got to dial on the ride height. We have to realign the whole car. That'll take some time. So what else is left? Well, it is admittedly a pretty long list, but it's pretty short compared to everything else we've gotten done. I've got a little bit of work left to do on the inside, some carpet work, some templating to do. I've got to mount the seats, got to mount the shifter, put the steering wheel in. Really not very much. Waiting on some pieces to come back from the upholstery shop. Got door cards to go in. In the front of the car, Paul's finishing up our hood. We've got the lights done. I've got to run our wiring harness. I've got some plumbing to do. All the plumbing still has to go back in the car. The wiring has to go back in the car. Otherwise, we're pretty good. Suspension's got to go on. Got to get fluids in this thing. Got to put the axles in. That's probably the biggest variable. I don't know if the axles do fit yet. I haven't put them in the car. We have to find out if my measurements are good. I'm hopeful that they are because I want to drive this thing in. Got a lot of little details to paint. Stuff to put on the car. I mean, it's a long list, but I feel really good about it. This thing is so freaking close. I am so stoked. So, if you're going to be at SEMA, I will be at the CSF Radiators booth, or I'll be cruising around. If you see me, come say hi, come see the car. I'd love to show you guys. I'd love to talk to you about it. I'll be there all week long. I am so stoked. I don't know if I'm going to have an episode out next week. It's just, I'm probably going to be pushing to get the car done. So, might have to wait till SEMA. Who knows? But either way, I will film what I am doing next week. We'll do another highlight reel, kind of like this episode. Hopefully you guys enjoy it nonetheless. We'll still talk about everything that it took to get it there, and then we'll call this the rough draft, revision 1. We got to start tuning it, testing it, driving it, and fix every single thing that it's going to need, and it's going to be a lot, I already know. But That's what this is all about. Anyways, I'll quit rambling. I am so freaking stoked. It's so close. I hope you guys have been enjoying this. Sorry for the absence. I hope you guys understand. I have just been putting in work to get this thing done. And now I got to edit this episode and then get back to it. So I'll catch you guys next week or during SEMA. Thank you as always for the support.